everybody, Madeline here. You are about to listen to our second ever live and local episode, and it's actually a recording of a presentation that I gave at the Holmes, Doyle and Friends conference in Dayton, Ohio a few weeks ago. I talked about podcasts. I talked specifically about Sherlockian podcasts. And it turned out that there are even more Sherlockian podcasts out there than even I knew about, and I really thought that I knew them all. So, my apologies for the omissions that I made. And both the podcasts that I covered and the podcasts that I didn't cover are going to be linked to in the show notes, so you can go find everything that is available. And also keep an eye out on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, because there are going to be some things going on in the spirit of inter-podcast cooperation. So, yeah, I hope you enjoy this talk. I apologize for the times that I fumbled or spoke too fast. I think that you guys know by now that sometimes I can get nervous just while podcasting, and boy howdy, talking in front of a live audience in person is a whole nother story. And this is my first time doing it. So I apologize for that. I apologize for when I messed up on names or got confused, but I hope that you like it. I hope that it's informative, and just be watching this space because we're gonna have more fun things upcoming. And with that, it's time to get on with the show.
Madeline is also the new canonical annotations editor for the Baker Street Almanac, and her first annotated story will be The Adventure of the Barrel Coronet in this year's Almanac. But her topic today is podcasts.
Always have to do this with microphones. All right. I hear Sherlockians everywhere, podcasting and community. Sherlockian podcasts have been going for 17 years now, and they have influenced the world of Sherlockiana and been influenced by it. So I wanted to take a look at the past 17 years through the lens of the podcasts that have come and gone. So to clarify what a podcast is, the Cambridge Dictionary defines a podcast as a radio program that is stored in a digital form that you can download from the internet and play on a computer or on an MP3 player. In short, it's a radio show for the internet age. Not like that. Cambridge was the only dictionary that called it a radio show. Now it's time to go back to June 2007. Social media is still in its infancy, and so is podcasting. And into this brave new world of digital innovation, Scott Monty and Bert Wolder boldly going where no Sherlockian has gone before with I Hear Sherlock Everywhere. iHost started out as an interview discussion show, and these days focuses on interviews. We get the latest news, but we also learn about days gone by and about Sherlockians who are no longer with us. iHost has come to be an oral history series in its own right on Sherlockiana, and I love that so much. But let's rewind a little. We move on from the first few episodes of iHose. Time passes. The first Warner Brothers movie with Robert Downey Jr. premieres Christmas 2009, and a few months later, July 2010, the first season of BBC Sherlock airs. And Sherlockiana experiences a wave. In May 2011, a group of young women come together to talk about their love for Sherlock and the original stories. This is, of course, the Baker Street Babes. The Babes become a hit, and it's not long before they're interviewing other Sherlockians and people involved in the making of Sherlock and other adaptations. Their ranks grow, and their outreach extends to events around the US and the UK. They form a bridge between the internet side of the fandom and traditional Sherlockiana for a few years. The show starts to fade after Sherlock ends, and only 4 episodes have dropped in the last 5 years, and I miss it. January 2013 sees a new show that is like and unlike the Babes, the Three Patch Podcast. Like the Babes, Three Patch has a rotation of co-hosts, but unlike, Three Patch focuses exclusively on Sherlock for a long time. They even have a show within their show called Spoilercast, which covers the filming of the 3rd and 4th seasons of Sherlock. Some of their members actually got to watch it, and even apparently showed up in some of the footage in the actual show, which I think is pretty cool. If the Babes had 1 foot in the internet and 1 foot in traditional goings-on, Three Patch is all internet. They still have a presence at in-person events, especially at 221 Beacon, but the podcast on the whole has a very Tumblr-esque flavor to it. It is also the longest of all the Sherlockian podcasts in terms of episode length, regularly running 2 hours or longer. I was like, whoa. Like, I feel bad when I get to 2 hours with my podcast. But for them, that's built in. Nowadays, they focus on internet fandom in general. Now for the discovery that came out of left field for me just a few days ago. The Sherlock podcast in January 2014. This show is 2 friends, Ian McKinnon and David Voxmullen, talking about the 3rd and 4th seasons of Sherlock as they air. The podcast actually belongs to a network of podcasts that is built on this theme of fan shows, and this one ended when Sherlock did. It just literally had nothing to keep it going. But it's a decent listen, and it did generate some fan interaction in its day. And honestly, I should have come before David, because in 2014, the first Sherlockian podcast drama debuts, I Am Lost Without My Boswell. And David, you did publish The Engineer's Thumb.
I did, yeah.
We already got an introduction to it, but I love that the text is presented as is, and the actors perform their roles in the original dialogue. And personally, I really need Boswell to make more episodes in the reasonably near future, because, David, I really want to hear you face off against Moriarty. I need that in my life.
It'll happen, don't worry.
In January 2017, Scott Monty and Brett Wolder answered fan demand for canon story discussion with Trifles. iHost becomes interview only, and the shorter and weekly Trifles becomes your one-stop shop for all kinds of story elements and details in the canon, big and small. My personal favorite type of Trifles episode is when they dig up scholarly papers and do a rundown of them. It's awesome to be introduced to those things in that way. Also in 2017, we get Sherlock Holmes is Real, which is its own unique beast. It is a docudrama, or probably more accurately a mockumentary, postulating that Sherlock Holmes is indeed real, and that the BBC and Sherlockian societies have been trying to cover that fact up for nearly a century. The podcast is currently hosted by the fictitious Talon King and the very real Paul Thomas Miller. Currently, the show takes the stance that the 1950s TV series with Ronald Howard is found footage of Holmes and Watson, and each new episode of the podcast delves into an episode of the TV show. And you might hear various familiar voices playing characters on that show. And now it's 2019. Sherlock is over, and CBS's Elementary is about to be over. By now, podcasting is an established medium, and the tools of the trade are easier to use. 2019 brings us a year full of new podcasts and a return to the source material, even if in some roundabout ways. January 2019 brings us the Jeremy Brett Sherlock Holmes podcast. Two brothers, Gus and Luke Howard, everybody struggles with that name, I think, embark on a project of talking about the Granada series from the perspective of longtime fans, but also from the perspective of being filmmakers themselves. So you get a lot of behind the scenes stuff that you might not get from other people who are just fans who would be talking about this show. Several years later, the show is still going, and they've interviewed many people involved with the show, including David Burke and June Wyndham Davies. And since the Granada series continues to be popular, even among millennials and Gen Z, the brothers have a pretty sizable audience, and the bonding between podcasters and audience over their shared love of Jeremy Brett is very palpable, to the point where they're actually hosting an event in the UK in May. I still wish I could go. In 2019, Brad Kiefhofer starts the Watsonian Weekly. The Watsonian Weekly is the John H. Swanson Society's look at your week just past and your week ahead. Like John H. Swanson, we might get a few dates wrong. We might mention keeping a bullpup once and not mention that again. But if you enjoy Watson, his writings, and random, possibly connected bits, there's a whole lot of Watson for you. Through the years, the show features a variety of segments mostly focused on Watson and a variety of voices from within the society, both in the segments and in the recordings of our monthly meetings. It's ever-changing, although we can reasonably say that of all the correspondents, Paul Thomas Miller is the one fixed point in a changing age. And currently we run a regular discussion segment based on the newest Sherlockian adaptation. But more on that in a few years and a couple of minutes. August 2019 brings the final Podblum, the first show to discuss the canon one story at a time. It's hosted by Casey Hills and Nicholas Cohen, and it is so much darn fun to listen to. These two friends are having, I swear, more fun podcasting than frankly anybody should have a right to. They're also going almost completely out of order, except for the stories that involve Moriarty, which was a good decision on their part. They developed the Huxtable Award for their favorite side characters, and they're all the time creating new animal characters based on the animals in the stories. My favorite is Prime Minister Polka Dots, who is none other than Dr. Roylott's cheetah. The show gets really silly, but it's a lot of fun. Also, sadly, it is no longer with us and only got through about half the canon. And I really wish they could have made it all the way through. So far, there is not a single canon story discussion podcast that has made it all the way through. So it's going to be interesting to see who finishes first. November 2019 gives us two new podcasts. First comes Sherlock, From Adler to Amberley, which is another story discussion show, and quite possibly the hardest of the podcasts to find, since it runs in the feed of a Ripperology show called Rippercast. Carl Kopak and John Reese co-host, and every episode they find a different guest to talk about the story of the day with them. They've had several prominent Sherlockians on in this way, including Les Klinger, Bonnie McBird, Bert Cools, although they've also let me on, so their standards can't be that high. But also in 2019, November 2019, a different sort of podcast debuts. Doings of Doyle, hosted by Mark Jones and Paul Chapman. Together, they explore Doyle's eclectic bibliography to understand more about the great man's life and work. They discuss his fiction and nonfiction, the well-known and the obscure, and stop by Baker Street along the way. Mark and Paul also interview people who have done work in the field of Doyleana. This interest in Sir Arthur Conan Doyle is, of course, very timely with the rise of the ACD Society and the literary agents and the scholarly journal Steel True Blade Straight. And that way, Doings of Doyle may be the first Sherlockian-esque podcast in a while to really tap into the zeitgeist. And then the world kind of ends in 2020. COVID sweeps the world, but we find out that even a global pandemic can't keep Sherlockians down. We find new ways to connect with each other. And in May 2020, Steve Doyle fires up the Fortnightly Dispatch on YouTube as a way to connect. Unlike iHost, the Dispatch isn't really covering news with its interviews. Instead, the interviews tend to be cozy chats between friends. The vibe really is that the world did explode, but Sherlockian survived, and it is still always 1895. Lockdown was a time during which many people tried and failed to be productive, but some bright souls actually managed it. And in October 2020, Marissa Mercurio and Sarah Kolb start a new canon story discussion podcast called However Improbable. This show doesn't just discuss the stories, however. You get narrations of the stories before each discussion. You also get the stories in quote-unquote chronological order. William S. Baring-Gould's chronology, to be specific, or one of them, because I hear there's two, which can be confusing if you don't know that Baring-Gould had Watson married 3 times. However Improbable appears to be coming back, finally, after a hiatus, and the hosts really do like to engage with their audience. Although nowadays with Twitter in the state that it's in, that's probably a little harder. But However Improbable is not the last canon story discussion podcast. Oh no. Because in April 2021, Anthony Abbott and Steve Steele create the Sherlocked podcast, not to be confused with the Sherlock podcast from earlier. And actually, like the final Podblum, one friend has read Sherlock Holmes, but not in a long time, and the other hasn't read Holmes at all before now. This leads to a lot of irreverent humor. The show actually has the shortest run out of all the canon story podcasts, making it to The Noble Bachelor before dipping out due to Anthony's wife having twins. And let's face it, having twins will do it. We can skip over this one, right? Okay. This one is my baby. Dynamics of a Podcast is the only podcast dedicated to Professor James Moriarty, Napoleon of crime, and arch nemesis of Sherlock Holmes. Basically, the Baker Street Babes had inspired me to want to do a podcast of my own, and I finally came up with a direction for it. I could focus on Moriarty. And my sister from another mister, who also lives in South Africa, Dixie Parkinson, agreed to do it with me. And so we talk about different topics, adaptations, even canon stories, because we have a goal of inserting Moriarty or Moran into every single canon story, and we will do it. We also hit the scene at just the right time because we've gotten to talk to some amazing creators and even actors regarding current Moriarty content. And since, for better or for worse, and we do acknowledge sometimes it's for worse, people keep using the professor in their adaptations, we are never gonna run out of material. Last September saw the debut of Sherlock Mondays, a live YouTube series and the latest biblioventure from the Rosenbach Library and Museum in Philadelphia. Edward G. Pettit has been hosting these biblioventures since early on in lockdown, going through classics such as Dracula, Frankenstein, Jane Eyre, and Pride and Prejudice, and now Ed has been going through the first 26 Sherlock Holmes stories. As always, he works with co-hosts who are his friends and have a variety of perspectives. In this case, Marielle Caro, Curtis Armstrong, Anastasia Klinchenskaya, and Monica Schmidt. Over the course of the biblioventures, Ed has built up a regular audience that jump from one show to the next. So there are a lot of people watching Sherlock Mondays who are reading the canon for the first time and talking about it on the YouTube chat and also on Facebook, which is a lot of fun. And then they ask a lot of questions like, does this happen? Does this happen? And we're like, yeah, it does. Just wait, keep reading. The show can also be listened to as part of the Rosenbach podcast. And the Rosenbach podcast in general looks really cool. So, last but certainly not least, and also came out last fall, Sherlock & Co. This is a drama It's the first professionally made Sherlockian podcast drama. This is John H. Watson in the modern day helping Sherlock Holmes fight crime while podcasting about it the whole time. It's a modern adaptation that brings the characters right up to the minute with the stories happening right now. Literally, the Blue Carbuncle not only happened at Christmas time, it happened last Christmas. Joel Emery was commissioned by Goalhanger Podcast to write a series which would adapt every story in the canon. At a rate of 2 to 3 episodes per story, the show thus far has 25 episodes and has told 10 stories, the most recent being The Creeping Man. And this is the show that we at the Watsonian Weekly are obsessed with, because John Watson is now one of us. He's a podcaster. That's amazing. But even more amazing is the community that has sprung up around this show. It's not a kids show, but there are a lot of actual kids listening to it and being introduced to Sherlock Holmes and digging into the canon for the first time because they want to know more. I really think that in about 10 or so years, we are going to meet a lot of young adults who got started with Sherlock & Co. And I think that is really cool. And so that brings us up to the moment. Sherlockians like to podcast. Somebody sooner or later is going to come up with another idea. It might very well be another canon story discussion podcast, because those seem to be popular. But we like to talk about Sherlock Holmes, and now we have this medium in which to do it. That can be a lot of fun. It's also a lot of hard work, let me tell you. I mean, you saw with David's editing. Most of us don't have to edit to that extent, but it's still a lot of work. But so to close, I was sending out questions to a lot of Sherlockian podcasters. And of course, I asked Scott and Bert some questions, and they gave me some comments that I really wanted to share because I think they were really lovely. Bert said that the podcasts are a great joy. I love meeting the new people and personalities we get to meet on iHost, and I love the topic-driven, unstructured nature of Trifles. It's still fun and exciting. And Scott said, in addition to the joy of meeting various Sherlockians and exploring their fascinating work, the weekly chats I get to have with Bert, both on and off the microphone, make this one of the most rewarding projects in my Sherlockian career. And right? It's very sweet, and honestly, I identify with all of that. I get it. It's a lot of fun talking with people that you haven't talked with before, and even some that you have on your show, and it's a whole lot of fun talking with your co-hosts, both in front of the mic and with the mic turned off. There's so much joy in it. So if the canon is a textbook of friendship and if Sherlockiana is about community, then Sherlockian podcasts are an extension of that. It's really all about friendship and community. Whoa. That is it. Yes, Anne?
Where would someone download most of these or some of these podcasts? The best place?
Most of them can be found on Apple Podcasts. That's usually the easiest, the first place to look, honestly. Some of them can also be found on Spotify, and a few of them have presences on YouTube. Oh, and I should say this talk is gonna go up on my podcast. So I'm going to have show notes that direct you to all the different shows. So yeah, if you want to listen to that, then come see me I have business cards that have the website address on it. So yes.
Kind of tangentially related, there's a podcast that I really love. It's called Oh God, really well written, and it spawned a role playing game. But the writing is excellent, and several other Call of Duty storyline we didn't mention too, so I thought you all might be interested in that.
Yeah, Old Gods of Appalachia. I have not listened to that, but I kind of like to because it does sound really good. Yeah. Kira.
I won't ask which actual podcast is your favorite, because there's a lot of people here. But is there any specific episodes of any of the podcasts that stand out to you as like favorite episodes?
Oh, that's a good question. I really like the recap episodes that different podcasts do because that was one of the things that made me really want to get involved with Sherlockiana. So it's a lot of fun listening to stuff that the things that I was not able to be at, and also since I've been involved with stuff, do my own recaps and yeah, there's something that I've really appreciated with like IOs especially is that a lot of people that I know and care about have been on that show, and so then sometimes when I'm feeling lonely or depressed, I will pop on one of those episodes and just like spend time with a friend in my ears, and Scott and Bert too. So it's really nice. Yes.
Longtime fan, first time caller. The interviews that you have done with some of the really big names at Moriarty in particular, Daniel Davis was on your podcast.
Mm-hmm.
It was a great interview.
Thank you.
You were respectful but playful. He loved hearing your energy. I could tell through the podcast.
He was such a gentleman, and
Yeah.
Dixie and I just had the best time talking with him.
And your podcast is also so conversational. You and Dixie have a rapport. Was there any difficulty in getting a big star guest like that on your podcast?
So what I did was I just put out a call on Facebook. I was like, I don't know if anybody has a connection, but also people in this fandom tend to have connections that I wouldn't, I'm like, wow. So I was like, maybe somebody knows something, and then Scott very kindly emailed me like the agent information that he found on IMDb Pro, and then I emailed the agency, and a few days later, I got an email back and nearly had a heart attack.
It was a great episode. If anybody hasn't listened to it, that's one I would definitely recommend.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if you are going to listen to any one episode of my own podcast, please listen to the Daniel Davis interview because that was amazing.
All the rest are great too.
Oh, thank you.
One thing you actually mentioned was the audience numbers for the Jeremy Brett cast. And how do you find numbers like that? I have there's so many different platforms.
Well, I can't actually, I have no visibility on that. But they have, like pretty much every episode, they open up fan mail. And that's how I can tell. Not every podcast gets fan mail, and some podcasts only get a very little bit of fan mail. So you can tell based on that and on the interactions they have with people on Facebook that they have a lot of listeners. So it's kind of
Got it.
yes.
One of the podcasts that I listen to says there's an app that you can download that will give you view counts because you can't see the likes on dislikes anymore. Gary Neurotic is Friday Night Type if you want to message him
Okay.
and see if he can help you out.
Okay, that'd be cool. Yeah. I actually have no idea what my listenership is, although I think it's only about 2,000 people at most. I mean, Scott and Bert like to joke that they have 7 listeners. That's very much not true. We're the ones who have 7 listeners. Anybody else?
Can I recommend one that you didn't mention? iGrok Sherlock. It's Mike Ranieri from the Bootmakers of Toronto, and then they do. I can't remember his partner's name, but they review all of the stories. I grok
What?
G-R-O-K.
Where is that?
G-R-O-K. On Apple, that's where I found it. I Googled Sherlock and it came up.
She missed one.
Rich, why couldn't you tell me before now?
I think it started around 2019, and there's quite a few episodes.
I've literally never heard of that one before. I swear, I mean, up until Monday, I swear I had 17 Sherlockian podcasts, and that made me really happy. And then I found the one that made me go, darn it, it's 18. And now I'm like, darn it, it's 19.
One more question for you.
Yes.
So you also mentioned that no podcast has completed a run of the entire canon.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it depends how you define podcast. And I know that this is not a podcast, but the Burt Cool's radio show.
Well, yeah, it's not a podcast.
I understand. It's an audio drama. And now we have what are like Sherlock & Co. is produced by a production company. It's released through a large network of production. And we call it a podcast because we can stream it and download it. But before there was such a thing, audio dramas took place. Those things. And what I think of is the adventure, the Edith Meisner adventures, where Watson was a character being interviewed by the guy who's selling you coffee or wine or whatever. And so it was just as meta as the podcasting. It's just that he was a radio show host.
Right.
So I see a long genetic connection, even though they're just podcasts.
Right. Well, I mean, you know, like I said at the beginning, a podcast is a radio show, but it's a radio show in our digital age. So, and there still have not been any canon story discussion podcasts specifically that have made it all the way through. So I'm kind of like watching them to see who gets through first.
The horse race.
Yeah. Yes.
Wouldn't the Granada one have the best shot? Granada did most, if not
It's not a podcast though.
That's what she said. The discussion.
And Burt Cool's is the first. The Clive Merrison radio show is the first adaptation to get through the entire canon. It's not the only one, but it is the first.
They actually did extra credit episodes.
They did do extra credit episodes. Is that it? All right, thanks so much.
Dynamics of a Podcast was created by Madeline Quinones, with sound design and editing by Dixie Parkinson, and music by Joshua Harvey. We do this podcast purely for the fun of the thing. Thank you for listening, and please join us next time.